What actually needs to be done is Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, needs to be compelled to taking Hezbollah on, disarming Hezbollah. I'm very pleased to see that Israel continues to enforce its own red lines. It must not go back to the days where it accepts the ever more dangerous encroachment of Hezbollah. We do not know whether the IDF will enjoy the full operational freedom inside the Gaza Strip to act against any threats that it sees emanating from there as and when they arise. We simply don't know. Another severe complication of this international force is that it is probably going to require that Israel withdraws from the yellow line. So that means that Hamas potentially can come ever closer to our cities, to our citizens. Hi folks, and welcome to this episode of the MirYam Institute Situational Briefing. Listen, if you're enjoying this content, I want to ask you to please go ahead and hit the subscribe button and also hit the bell icon so that you receive all of our latest updates right when we release them, together with our incredible footage from the field. It really does help us to reach an ever wider audience, and I thank you in advance of your partnership in that regard. And also, remember, we want to know what's on your mind and we want to hear your questions. So please leave those for us in the comments section and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And with that, it's on with the show. With regard to the IDF's activities in southern Lebanon and their very clear readiness to tackle the ongoing threat of Hezbollah in that area, we've seen a change in the attitude of the US envoy to Lebanon, Tom Barrack, who warned in a conference recently that Hezbollah terrorists were still ensconcing themselves in southern Lebanon. They were still in possession of far too many of their arms. And that was actually something that contradicted the tone of optimism that was coming out of Washington, D.C. If you remember, just a few weeks ago, there were many people talking about the possibility of normalization with Lebanon, even Lebanon joining the Abraham Accords, something I was very skeptical of at the time and remain so to this day. So if you cast your minds back to when Lebanon, or Hezbollah rather, decided to join the fray in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attack in 2023, I believe Hezbollah joined in approximately October the 10th. By that time, they were already harassing Israelis by way of sending munitions our way. Israel always stated that Hezbollah terrorists would have to be completely removed from the area of southern Lebanon, that southern Lebanon would have to become a demilitarized area, and that there would have to be a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, essentially a buffer zone, and the enforcement of Resolution 1701. I felt that Israel was right to demand those conditions as a bare minimum for ending the conflict against Hezbollah inside southern Lebanon. And it turned out that actually none of those conditions were met. What actually happened was that after Israel had severely downgraded Hamas operatives inside the Gaza Strip, and after the beeper operation and then the walkie-talkie operations were carried out, Israel turned its full attention towards tackling Hezbollah, severely downgraded them, fought valiantly, scored tremendous victories in every single direct altercation that they had against Hezbollah operatives, completely decimated their command and control structure. Prime Minister Netanyahu also launched the targeted elimination of the senior ranks of Hezbollah, including Hassan Nasrallah himself. But there was no implementation of Resolution 1701. There was no demilitarized zone there between northern Israel and southern Lebanon on the southern Lebanese side of the border. And what has been left is the need for Israel to continually enforce its own red lines. And I think that it's positive that we continue to do that, but I don't believe that that's a resolution to the challenge that Hezbollah continues to face. What actually needs to be done is Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, needs to be compelled, preferably by the Americans, to deploy all of the capabilities of the Lebanese armed forces to taking Hezbollah on, disarming Hezbollah, and then enforcing the terms of Resolution 1701. And I repeat, it's not a perfect outcome. I believe that's the very bare minimum that Israel is right to expect and to demand. We're a far cry from being there, but I'm very pleased to see that Israel continues to enforce its own red lines. It must not go back to the days of October the 7th and just prior to October the 7th, where it accepts and lives with the ever more dangerous encroachment of Hezbollah either towards the border or even, dare I say it, beyond the border. The United States is in the midst of pushing forward an idea of an international force that will essentially not be a peacekeeping force, but it will be a force of enforcement of the terms of the 20-point deal that we saw President Donald Trump broker just a few short weeks ago. And you'll remember that as an integral part of that deal, there was a requirement for Hamas to disarm, and there was a requirement for the Gaza Strip to be demilitarized. Two very different things, incidentally. Important that people understand the distinction between the two. Now, this international force, or force of enforcement, for want of a better phrase, is actually going to be subordinate to, or under the purview of, the Board of Peace. And that Board of Peace was something that we also heard President Trump speak about, not once, but at least twice. And it's a board, the top of which he sits at. He is scheduled to oversee that board. Now, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to this international force, which is supposed to take up its role in January, as early as January, and is expected to operate inside the Gaza Strip for not less than 2 years, with the option to extend its mandate in the area. A couple of the challenges include, firstly, we don't know, although the Israel Defense Force is expected to be a participant therein, we do not know whether the IDF will enjoy the full operational freedom inside the Gaza Strip to act against any threats that it sees emanating from there as and when they arise. We simply don't know. We also are right to raise questions and must raise questions about the wisdom of having a Palestinian police force, which essentially has already been formed up, according to reports, being responsible for the dismantling of Hamas weapons once they are taken in hand. I don't think that if we look at the example of Judea and Samaria and the effectiveness of the Palestinian Authority in that area, that we should expect with any great optimism effectiveness of a Palestinian police force operating inside the Gaza Strip. And then, in addition to those complications, is this real worry that this sets a dangerous precedent, namely that there is an international force that is deployed to the Gaza Strip, and then that model, whether it proves incidentally effective or not, and I'm very, very unsure that it will be proven effective, that same model will then be overlaid onto Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. That again, Israel's ability for full operational freedom to take out terror threats as we see them emerge in Judea and Samaria, that will be impeded and subordinate to the wills and whims of an international force that is answerable to this Board of Peace that I mentioned we heard President Trump talk about. Now, I also want to say that what we're seeing here is really the outcome of wishful thinking. It's a cautionary tale about wishful thinking. You will remember that President Donald Trump publicized Hamas's response to his 21 at that time. It was later reduced to 20 points, but his 21-point peace proposal or ceasefire deal. And in that published Hamas response, there was an agreement by Hamas to hand over the remaining living hostages, all 20 of them. Thankfully, those have been returned. And to return the deceased hostages. There are still several yet to be returned home. Incidentally, at the time of recording, Israel is expecting the return of a further deceased hostage, pending verification of that being the case, of course. But Hamas had very clear conditions that expressed that it would be willing to disarm if the so-called, falsely called occupation of the Gaza Strip was to come to an end. Now, the IDF is still inside the Gaza Strip. There's no reason to think that Hamas didn't mean what it said. It did not agree to disarm. And I think that there was a great deal of wishful thinking behind the idea that what it said it did not actually mean. And now we're seeing that actually what it said is precisely what it meant, namely that it's not willing to disarm. And another severe complication of this international force is that it is probably going to require that Israel withdraws from its current array within the Gaza Strip along what's come to be called as the yellow line. So that means that Hamas potentially can come ever closer to our cities, to our citizens, to our kibbutzim, to our communities, and Israel will be expected essentially to place its security and to outsource that security unto this international force. One final note about this. People will likely recall that UNIFIL, which is the United Nations International Force in Lebanon, was stood up in 1978 with the goal of enforcing Resolution 1701. I personally served along the border in 2006, in the summer of 2006, between Israel and southern Lebanon. I stood there in static positions. I patrolled those areas. I took part in ambushes in those areas. I know that area reasonably well. And I saw in the events prior to the Second Lebanon War of 2006 the complete, total, and utter failure of UNIFIL to fulfill its mandate. Indeed, I saw UNIFIL actively working with, cavorting with, socializing with Hezbollah terrorists who were in the Hezbollah outposts along the southern border of Lebanon and doing absolutely nothing whatsoever to prevent, quite clearly, as history teaches us, the arming up of that terrorist army. So I don't put a great deal of faith in the potency and capability of international forces at the best of times. And I think that we should all view askance the idea that an international force inside the Gaza Strip, when Hamas is not yet disarmed itself, has not yet been disarmed by an outside force, we should all view askance the likelihood of the success of such a force. Hamas has made a bizarre request for some 200 of its terrorists who are trapped essentially in the terror tunnels beneath the ground of the Gaza Strip to be granted safe passage into the area beyond the yellow line that is not held and overseen by the Israel Defense Forces. And it's it's triggered a very interesting response from Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, who is the chief commander or chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces. He's actually made a public statement. He has said that the only way that he will consider such a request with any favorability whatsoever is if Hamas hands over the remains of Lieutenant Hadar Goldin of blessed memory. Lieutenant Hadar Goldin was a young officer who served in the elite unit of the Givati Brigade in Operation Protective Edge in 2014. He was killed in the course of that operation. Incidentally, he was killed operating about 700 meters from where his twin brother, Saw Goldin, who is alive and campaigns for the return, obviously, of his sibling's body. He was operating about 700 meters from where Saw was operating at the same time, just to show you the dedication of this family. Saw was a young officer in the Maglan unit, one of the most elite units on the face of the earth today. And Hadar Goldin's body was taken into the tunnels of Gaza and has been held for ransom for not less than 11 years. His parents, Leah and Simcha, have been campaigning since that time to this very day. And Eyal Zamir has said that the only way that he will even consider releasing these Hamas terrorists is if Lieutenant Hadar Goldin is returned to his family for burial. So it shows you just how seriously we take the return of our deceased hostages. And it shows you again the depravity of Hamas, because there are very few within Israel who believe that Hamas is unaware of the precise whereabouts of Lieutenant Hadar Goldin's body, and yet they continue to drip feed us our dead in this dreadful, cruel manner.